666.
We are very pleased to be speaking now with Princess Mashael bint Saud Al Shalan, founding partner at Aeon Strategy based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which played a leading role in support of the kingdom's net zero targets under the Saudi Green Initiative and the Circular Carbon Economy Framework. Mashael, thank you so much for joining us. Nice to see you.
No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Hi, Mashael. So great you could be with us. This is one of our favorite ways to do this. Our good friend Saud Al Shalan, who's on a few episodes ago, and I recommend everybody listen to that episode. She's terrific. Soon after we had we spoke, she sent a note. She says, "Oh, I was just on this panel, and you have to get this person on. She's really, really good." And that, of course, was you.
You're overselling it right before we jump into the topic. So I hope her assessment still stands by the end of our conversation.
Oh no, she was really pleased, and so we're delighted to have you and to talk about a topic I think actually both neither Lucia and I are really expert in any way on, but is really important to Saudi Arabia, really important to the planet. Before we do that, can you talk a little bit about your journey to get where you are as founder of Aeon Strategy and Collective, but what brought you to this point, and actually the key to I think our conversation is why.
Yeah, to me, thinking about sustainability and about development in a perpetual sense that does not harm the environment, does not harm the ecosystem, was almost always natural as an inclination. It never felt that it was something that needed to be uttered or framed under the framework of sustainability. Maybe my first way of coinciding with that kind of world was when I was a very young child. I recall a time when the first Gulf War happened. I was based out of Riyadh at the time. My grandfather, because of his work, could not leave Riyadh, so we decided to stay with him. And as soon as the war finished, we were part of this bigger effort. Obviously, as kids, we weren't doing much, but seeing a lot of the adults in our lives of this cleaning efforts of the oil spills in the Gulf in around the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And I recall this big image of this big blob of oil hitting the shores and thinking, wow, that does not look nice. That does not smell or feel nice. And then seeing a bird trapped in it was sort of seared into my mind. Also, being an asthmatic kid, knowing that because of fear and pressures, and I don't know if anyone recalls, at the time there was a threat of chemical warfare. We had to wear these masks when we were still in the city. So the first point of action that my grandfather decided as soon as the war was over was to go to the desert. So we spent about a month in the middle of a desert, just recovering, sitting between us and nature, in spite of maybe it being intuitive. It was not causing an uptick in my asthma, it was actually helping it calm down. So there was this signal as well that some of this naturescape that we're sometimes fearful of is not necessarily having the detrimental effect. It's not necessarily the dust that would be associated if it was not pushed to its limitations, let's say, from some of these additional pressures on both the environment and the climate. So this was the initiation of my journey into the space. So naturally, I took that aspect of it for granted. The other thing, I think for most of us Saudis, energy is something that we don't think we're too good at understanding because it's always in the backdrop of a lot of conversations, questions around oil prices, questions around electrification. We always think of them as an afterthought and think, well, everyone must know that. I sort of hit a brick wall when I attempted to do my master's education. I went into it thinking I'll carry on the history and lineage of my family of going into security studies, because naturally that's a space that women were not going into, and it was really interesting. I was shocked.
This is at Columbia, right?
This is at Columbia, yeah. I was really shocked going into SEPA that the program first weekend was super concentrated on the US. So I was like, okay, I'm going to spend the next 2 years doing that. It was some sort of an internal crisis. But then I realized that there are other choices and I can switch. This notion of subspecializing in sustainable development, understanding as well that if I could specialize in the applied sciences, then I can almost act like having these different escapades outside of the policy school into all sorts of sciences, which is always a hobby of mine, playing fake scientists in one discipline or the other. So it sort of satiated my curiosity. And I came out of it, at the end of it, was around 2014. That was just as the new development agenda was being put forth at the UN, what became the SDGs at some point. Also, the initial ideations around the Paris Agreement. So it's just a question of an opportune framing at the right time, I guess.
Fascinating. I remember that ecological disaster, that Gulf War. Because a lot of, obviously a lot of wells were blown up intentionally, but it's fascinating to hear a personal story of actually encountering it and the impact it made. So you're off to Colombia. You reworked your whole curriculum. And as you say, it is fortuitous. You finished in 2014. Paris Agreement is 2015, which was monumental in a lot of ways. I think we've done things on 966 about the environment and COP, the 26, 27, now upcoming 28. And the Paris Agreement was sort of a tipping point where let's stop discussing if climate change is real and actually see if we can take some steps to address it. How does that translate to you, and how does it translate to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think that was another serendipitous occasion, because it just so happened that one of the main thinkers or main architects of the Paris Agreement used to wear both hats of Columbia and Sciences Po. She was Madame Laurence Tubiana, who was tasked with the undertaking of coming up with a structure for an agreement that would allow an increased level of ambition after a certain point of time. But most importantly is to get all countries, in spite of their big diverse circumstances, to agree on one document that this will be our North Star, this will be our pathway forward. And to be honest, I was fresh graduate, have barely mastered the 101s of climate policy and understood just the complexity of collective action. And we went into it both in terms of helping and converse and situate the situation in Saudi Arabia as Saudis to Madame Laurence Tubiana and what will be the main points of connectivity. And I have to say the French were really good at the diplomacy aspect of it. They took their time going to different countries, understanding how they could come up with something that would allow a pathway forward. If we don't remember it well as well, the US and China sort of coalescing and saying that we'll put our differences aside when it comes to the climate and we'll seek some pathway for collaboration, helped propel the momentum forward in the lead up to Paris. But some people might forget that it actually went, I think, if my memory serves me well, 2 days over time. And up to the last moment, we were also on the edge of our seat thinking that this is not going to happen because they kept getting sticked around certain words of must or shall up to the last moment as well. I vividly recall one of our colleagues from Nicaragua sort of raising his hand in objection, and Laurent Fabius looking across the board and saying, "No objection, the Paris Agreement has been adopted."
Enough of this.
Yeah, I think that our colleague from Nicaragua wanted even more ambition, but Laurent Fabius understood that was the limit at which they could pass an agreement at that point. Obviously, a lot of the hard work was not put into that first text. So some of the details of what was called the rule book was sort of pushed to a point later in time. What they understood at that point was you needed to rebuild this question of trust on the system, and a trust of going into something that would allow for flexibility for different countries' circumstances.
Fascinating. So you established the Aeon. Now what's it? You have Aeon Collective, and then there's Aeon Strategy. Correct. And
well, it was not me on my own. It was myself and my partner.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. A collective you.
Yes.
Can you and it's by the way, all your work, website, papers, that sort of thing, are really well done. I don't know who who's putting your stuff together or your creative designer, that sort of thing, but it's well done.
Thank you. We're sticklers. I think between Noor and myself, we're sticklers for design. Information on its own, unfortunately, is not enough to connect to a wider audience. So understanding how do you project it and do it in a way that connects visually to people is very important.
Well, it shows and it reflects well on you. It's very detail oriented. It's very attractive in the way it's done. But right at the top, about, and we'll start thinking. It's a cross disciplinary waqf, and I think, which is a nonprofit endowment fund. But I think for our listeners, what a waqf is interesting. But that actively supports sustainability and development. But can you take us through how you, the collective, what Aeon Collective is, what Aeon Strategy is, and just tell us about this story.
Yeah, of course. So we understood, well, we were lucky enough, I think, and maybe stupid enough, both Noor and I, to have applied.
By the way, this is how we feel about the 966.
Yeah. Good. Because sometimes putting all of your eggs into one basket is not highly recommended. But I think we were also youthful enough to think that we might get away with it. We both applied to the same program at SIPA. We were cousins. Thinking that most definitely they'll accept the two of us. Noura was accepted there first, actually. I got waitlisted, only to be accepted a few weeks after the fact. Very, very, very scary weeks. But as we were going through that program, we were sort of trying to imagine, well, what we do after the fact that we graduate. We wanted to start from a point that we were able to support on our own. That was not reliant on any external counterparts, that would enable us to sort of chart our own vision to what needed to exist within the ecosystem. And that's why to us, creating a consultancy was the lowest hanging fruit. It's something that we could develop between my mind and hers that did not require much else other than our ability to think within a space. We definitely started from the very bottom. So starting to try and understand within that space, what are the dynamics? Our expertise was in policy, but proper policy making cannot function in vacuum. We cannot come fresh out of university and try to apply our chops on understanding models or different policies that have worked in other circumstances to Saudi Arabia. So we started the very bottom, understanding the dynamics of the home, people's consumption patterns, behavioral patterns, what would work and what wouldn't. That happened to be around the period when Vision 2030 was starting to emerge, and with it, a beginning of an understanding of this concept of sustainability, alignment of that to the SDGs in the kingdom. So I have to say in the beginning, we were not envisioning a sustainable development consultancy, right? For us, sustainability was a given. Obviously, coming through academia, it was also overused in a lot of cases, but we understood that the ecosystem was starting to understand it, and there was a massive opportunity to start to influence the space from within. Obviously, the ambitions of Vision 2030 that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has put forth enabled a very clear signal to all of the ecosystem in Saudi Arabia that the way that things have operated in the past could no longer happen in the future. There needed to be almost a complete redefinition of how we approach the question, primarily this massive area of abundance of energy. So we started building it piece by piece, understanding the energy efficiency component at a later stage, understanding then how that could be influencing the energy price reform part of the equation, and then starting to understand, well, what would a pathway for Saudi Arabia look like in terms of a decarbonization? So what would a net zero pathway for Saudi look like? And it's through that prism that we started to work more and more with government on both the crafting of policies, on the helping the development with a lot of brilliant colleagues in their own right, both within the institution and without, on some national level programs, be it the Circular Carbon Economy National Program or other efforts, that there needed to be that kind of drive from within to understand what would policies that are in alignment with Saudi Arabia's set of endowments look like, and how can we ensure that this is something of credibility that would ensure continuity in the long run. At the same time, as we were doing these efforts from within the system, we understood very early on that that cannot happen in vacuum. Maybe sometimes the limitations of what a client wants, wishes, desires, ties you to a specific corner or a space of ideation. And we needed to have this additional body that attended to the public good. And that was the inception of Aeon Collective, of a waqf that's independent, that allowed us to work without any red lines, that allowed us to explore and push the boundaries of concepts that were not yet ripe for picking, let's say, in our early operations as the consultancy. So some of the concepts around the early definitions of the circular carbon economy concept, understanding that that would not come to pass without a net zero goal or target. Some of the work around carbon markets, a price on carbon, were some of the early facets of what we started to do under the collective. So where we stand today, I think on a much varied group of topics, as both the consultancy grew, including within it different areas of expertise on a broad range of topics, from arts and culture to built environment sustainability to ecosystem regeneration, restoration. It allows us to sort of have this tug and pull from both sides of the equation towards a common goal. I always say it in short to us. I think this is our mindset, is our real client is Saudi Arabia and the well-being of the country. So we don't see it as two different pieces or competing interests into one space. But these are all bodies that are trying to get us in a certain directionality and the small role that we can play within this bigger ecosystem.
Are you guys you're doing consultancy like just in Saudi? Like, do you have clients outside of Saudi Arabia around the world, or are you expanding, or where are you on that?
We do. Actually, we have a team that's quite diverse. So our head of built environment sustainability just came from Lend-Lease. So she has massive experience from the US built environment aspect. Two leads on ecosystem regeneration, restoration are also based out of the US, from Colorado and I'm trying to remember where the other one was based out of, Cleveland, and then some massive experience as well in Europe. So they're quite diverse, and with it an ability to connect to different projects around the world. We have done projects outside of Saudi in the past, but because of the opportunity of what's happening here, the bulk of our focus to date has been in Saudi, mostly, except for the odd projects.
So you just tossed off a bunch of big concepts right there. And, the Saudi Green Initiative, carbon tax, circular carbon economy. These are big, big issues that Saudi Arabia is dealing with, and they're trying to formulate how to deal with it. Have you been plugged in on each of these in terms of how the government is trying to address these topics? And they're big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our first, that's where I see a lot of connectivity, honestly, between Saudi Arabia and the United States. For a lot of our thinking and a lot of the thought processes, and maybe in some ways, the general timeline of the makeup of an economy and an ecosystem falls under a similar, oddly, trajectories. So when I'm talking about the concept of the circular carbon economy, for example, the first time I came across it was from the Department of Agriculture in the US. And that was their attempt of trying to figure out what would a systematic way of looking at emissions from the agricultural sector look like when it comes to the carbon piece, and how can we start addressing it in a way that's systematic, that does not only look at one point in this journey, but looks at it from the beginning to the end. In the Saudi context, and I think very far from thinking, and maybe tangentially not connected to that initial inception, was the coming up with this framework from His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman. So I remember him being appointed Minister of Energy end of 2019. There was the incident that happened in the Eastern Province, as we all recall, to some of our massive oil wealth repositories, let's say. At the same time,
that was diplomatic. When you were attacked.
Yes. The other way that we can also look at it is that was not a point where we were saying, but we reacted so well that the ecosystem thought that it must be easy and that nothing really happened, in spite of how big that impact was at the time. Arguably, that was also a signal that we're not standing still. And what His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman clearly signaled, as I recall, around it was the MISC Global Forum, introduction of a pathway to both balance the sustainability element in our hydrocarbon intensive ecosystem. It was the formulation or the utterance of the circular carbon economy as a framework. It wasn't yet defined at the time. and a lot of different colleagues within the think tank ecosystem started to work on it. We did our own take as well and published a paper in the beginning of March 2020 on the definition of the concept. But in short, it's a system that looks at carbon throughout the value chain. And similar to the circular economy, sort of anchors around the 3 R's of the circular economy, but adds a fourth one just to deal with the nature of carbon within the system. So the first is the reduce component, so just minimize emissions. You can think of it as mitigation in its most definite ways. Energy efficiency, renewables, all sorts of ways that you're bypassing emissions. Then you go to the reuse component and the recycle component. So either taking the carbon and using it again in the reuse case without changing its chemistry. So in this bottle that's not seen, I mean, I have Perrier inside it, and that's water with some sparkling gas. That's CO2 that's being injected into it. So that sort of defines the reuse component. The recycle is a space where you would modify the chemistry a little bit. So you can think of it in simple terms of creating ammonia or ways that you would grow your plants better with the use of these fertilizers. So that's the recycle component. And at the very least, and most importantly, is this remove component. And why is it important? We already have too much CO2 in the atmosphere. We need to find some way of tackling it by either removing it directly of the atmosphere or removing it from the systems that are usually emitting. So you can think of it in the form of scrubbers and power plants. Instead of putting that additional CO2 in the atmosphere, you're capturing it and doing useful things with it, either by storing it or by putting it under the recycle or the reuse component. So to us, that sort of signified a way that looked at a comprehensive system and a systematic approach of tackling GHG emissions, which to our expectation up to a certain point was not done in the past. So while maybe the rest of the world might see it as a Saudi endeavor or a Saudi effort, we see it as a way that looks at a systematic approach for decarbonization that is agnostic to the pathway that you take, as long as you tackle the main culprit in that case, which are emissions.
It's interesting that you made the parallel with the U.S. And when we spoke last week, I was laughing about my youngest, who's my daughter, who's a senior in college now, but she's been interning at a sustainability startup, essentially. And when she first, and she loves it, and when she first started, I said, yes. You need to get into sustainability because nobody knows what it is, but everybody feels like they should do it. Yeah. So is this, it's a different governing approach in Saudi Arabia. And one of the great advantages in Saudi Arabia is, if there's a decision is made and you can move pretty quickly on it, you don't have some of the intervening steps in the US that might slow down a process or might, weaken an initiative. How is it received in Saudi Arabia? When we talk about sustainability in Saudi Arabia and you're going out and you're talking to corporates, you're talking to individuals, you're talking to institutions, how is it perceived?
I mean, I have to say that in the beginning, there was not much receptiveness to the issue of sustainability. It was seen as a nice to have component or something that would cost a lot of money. And I'm talking here pre-2018, right, as people were starting to wrap their head around some of those key concepts. To us, the biggest signal that the government has sent was the inception of the Saudi Green Initiative. It did one of two things. One, the fact that it's annual, it's cyclical. I like to call it our own ratchet mechanism. So this is my nerd within me. If you're thinking about the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, every country around the world is asked to put better ambitions. What we're doing in Saudi Arabia, well, we said we're doing that on an annual basis. So there's a way of tracking progress. There's a way of every single player of a certain size within the ecosystem of putting forth what are they doing to enable us to achieve that goal of net zero by 2060. So without that goalpost, none of this would have been possible. It also signaled the seriousness with which the government is tackling the issue. So while, let's say in the details of it, we're very much a top harmonizer kind of country where we set broad goals and targets, but then when it comes to the details of how do you deliver, we're very much a bottomish up kind of approach. So it's never command and control. It's never you have to do X, Y, and Z up to a certain point until the different players gain confidence. It's always an invitation of what can you contribute? What do you see as something that's exciting within the space? I think that's the general space of operation for sort of the private sector players within the system. And we've seen over time the level of sophistication of understanding of what does sustainability mean, and what does sustainability mean to us in that context as, for example, Red Sea Global. What does sustainability mean to us as Kingston Land Park? It starts to trickle down and become a lot more granular in that context. And we're seeing it go beyond these bigger projects where sustainability is almost expected as the norm to other smaller projects that are starting to integrate some of those frameworks. Now, where I think there's still a lot to be done, and that's where institutions like ours in collaboration with others have a lot to do, is in terms of reaching the broader public. So I think I've chatted with you on the sidelines of this before, Richard, but Lucian, I don't know if you're aware of the temperature increases that we've already witnessed in Saudi Arabia. We're considered as the Arabian Peninsula overall, but more specifically in Saudi Arabia, even more specifically among the coast of the Arabian Gulf, as one of the hot zones of temperature increases, right? So when we're talking about this 1.5 degree, 2 degree goal or target, what we've already seen in our region compared to, let's say, the Northern Hemisphere increases per decade. Per decade, on average, everywhere around the world, we've seen a consistent 0.37 degrees C increase every decade. Our region had witnessed 0.48 degrees C in our region alone, which means that we're much closer to that 1.5 degree than we would have anticipated in the past. And of course, that has its own set of connotations. But, if you lower the temperature in your room by 1 or 2 degrees, it would be very difficult to feel. Even upping it by 1 or 2 degrees would also be difficult to feel. Corner to that thinking, especially in our region, is that we've witnessed massive amounts of growth in that same period. So I always say, if the temperature increased by 3 or 4 or 5 degrees, depending on the wet bulb aspect and depending on the city, if my bus stop is air conditioned and my car is air conditioned and my office is air conditioned, it would be very difficult for me to sense that relatively slight temperature increase in the short term. Over longer periods of time where you have maybe less opportunity to act, you might start feeling it more and more prominently in a stickier fashion over multiple years. But it's a question of what action can the government and the bigger players do as you catch up the level of, let's say, education within the public of the changes that we've already witnessed to date.
Yeah, we've the global heat wave, has sparked a lot of discussion. We've done Lucian did a segment on it recently. So the Aeon Collective, and it focuses. Your office sent a really interesting series of documents, and the tree library. I want to get to you to see exactly what that is. But you focus on climate change, pollution, biodiversity. How do you go about this in terms of education and consulting and advice?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a step back and think, why do we focus on all of those 3 topics? Sometimes people think that if you handle or tackle one of them, then by default you're tackling the others. I've had a recent unfortunate example that I saw firsthand of how that does not seem to work. So we went to visit a friend of ours in Costa Rica, of all places. I don't know if you're familiar with the Asa Peninsula. Have either of you been to Costa Rica?
Yeah, I have, but not to that peninsula, I don't think.
Yeah, it's known as one of the hot zones of biodiversity. So it's incredibly beautiful, both in terms of the marine diversity and the terrestrial. So we went to visit a friend of ours that ran an NGO there that was placed in a primary forest. And what we were seeing on our drive over was these what I call severed highways of carbon credits, right? So we think we'd be doing well by planting some of these trees and issuing carbon credits for each of those trees. But if we do them in the wrong way, if we, let's say, plant the exact same tree in a specific plot of land, we'd be destroying that plot, both in its capability of capturing more carbon in the soil, or in some cases, things that are as simple as severing highways for certain types of monkeys. So unbeknownst to me, one of the types of monkeys there relied on its tail to move from one place to the other.
Oh.
The tree that they just happened to plant within that plot did not have enough branches to enable that monkey to move from one primary forest to the other. So without knowing, we were severing highways for some of those animals, and with it, their ability to cope, their ability to adapt to a lot of the pressures that they were facing. So we understood very early on that sometimes trying to solve for one issue would not be, by definition, solving for another. And we needed to have this comprehensive outlook at how we tackle things within the space. Obviously, as well, because of the diversity of the topics, these are not things that we can take on our own. So that word collective is something that we take to heart. It's something that requires us to pull along the strengths of all of these different players within the ecosystem. So if you're thinking, what roles could we be playing within it? We take one of three main roles. One is that of harmonizers. So where we see really good efforts happening within the ecosystem, but might be a lot more effective, we try and connect the dots and try to push some kind of cohesion and directionality to where things are heading. In spaces where we see maybe an effort not exist, but there's some good solid research that could provide some solid outcome, we play the role of architects. I mean, a big example of that is a publication that we launched last year on the state of climate and health research in the GCC. We knew different researchers were working on different pieces. Some pieces were not at all addressed by subject matters within the field or tangentially on how that relied back to climate change. We tried to put all of those pieces of the puzzle and come up with something that's cohesive on the matter. And the last, and where we see major gaps, we play the role of catalysts. So in spaces where we know no one else is sort of being the pallbearer or are too reserved to go into that space because of one reason or the other, like some of the early explorations of carbon pricing, we tend to be first movers within that space, bringing on board all of these different players, building up their confidence, in some cases building up their capacities to be able to deliver on what's needed in the space. We say in Arabic, يد واحدة ما تصفق, so there's nothing that you can do on your own. You transliterate it to say one hand cannot clap, you need both to be able to do something. So that's something that we try to ingrain into all of the efforts that we do. Collaboration is a really cool word. Collective has a nice ring to it, but I have to tell you from experience firsthand, it's not as easy as one might like it to be, but it is worth the payoff. Doing things in collaboration, in coalition with other players in the space. For areas of topic for us for this year, we're mainly focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. We're doing a lot of work on how do you leverage sports for climate action, and this new space that we're exploring around what role could the arts be playing in providing better, more comprehensive healthcare and opportunities for well-being within the Arab region.
So whose ear do you have? And I say that because in terms of development of policy that drives a lot of this, are you plugged? Are you able to, are policymakers, are they reaching out to you for, how might we do this? And this, as I said, this extends all the way from the Saudi Green Initiative to, the policy that they'll take over to the next COP, Egypt 4 or the upcoming one. Are you able to plug in when policy is formulated and debated and considered?
It depends. It depends on which piece of the puzzle. There are certain stakeholders that we've known for years. I think a key component of all of that is building up trust between different players within the system, ensuring as well that trust is earned. It's not something that people would give to you, and it has to be built on knowledge that's being developed within that specific space of interest. In a lot of cases, we saw that we were not trying to push things because we thought that they needed to happen. It was sort of a combination between getting certain decision makers trust, having conversations around it, not being sticklers to our initial idea because things evolve. We might be wrong, and we were wrong in a lot of circumstances. Being humble enough to know when you are and when you aren't, and how to focus on the betterment of the idea to move things forward. We take this philosophy that we sort of borrowed from Islamic heritage and what they added to this confirmation, this idea of debate. We don't like the word debate. It's not about my idea winning or that of the others. It's this question of tanadhur. So it's mainly anchored around how can you make the idea better, and how can you ensure that sometimes perfection is not what wins. It's what could be passed or would be passable. So having that level of pragmatism and malleability be integrated into the process. I mean, from inception as well, it was starting and creating these safe spaces where people can have conversations. We started it with the Saudi Sustainability Talks, for example, where people are not their institutions. They're just coming in with their brains, their perspectives, creating spaces where the opinion of others are respected, and ensuring that these are not as well pie in the sky kind of thinking. These are things that are implementable, that are in alignment with certain pain points of decision makers, be it in government or in some of the bigger companies operating spaces.
In the bigger picture, what role can Saudi play? I say that because they just hosted an international conference on Ukraine. They're really expanding their diplomatic reach, their diplomatic activity. Saudi Arabia and the king and the crown prince see Saudi Arabia as a middle power, sort of a nexus between Europe, Asia, and Africa. A leader in the region across any number of areas. It's also, the leading energy producing, nation in the world. It's working towards a post-oil economy. It's engaging with on climate change at the recent COPs and talking about, all right, let's expand our understanding of how do we mitigate emissions and not just reduction of production, but also carbon capture. So they're already taking a more active, engaged role on the issue of sustainability.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, where we envision Saudi playing a massive role is in bridging this gap of this crisis of trust that's existing globally. So when we're talking about this triple planetary crisis, just to narrow it down into one sentence, in reality, what we're trying to do, and by the way, we're seeing examples of this happening all around the world. With the El Nino hitting this year, we're seeing forest fires, floods. We've just seen the devastating fires in Maui a few days ago. These are all happening in a context where people are antagonizing the positions of one another. Everyone is trying to sort of pander to their own demographic and public. There's been a continuously narrowing space and room for this quiet diplomacy, and that's where I think Saudi Arabia could play a massive role. I like to call it the Bedouin approach to policymaking. I mean, just because of the nature of how we used to live in these really hard to reach places, you had to deliver based on two core beliefs and tenets, is that you cannot overpromise. So you had to always have a level of credibility in what you're promising. And what you were always aiming for is over-delivering. So combining the two, the biggest example of that is committing to net zero by 2060. Would we have loved 2060? No. I think 2060 is way too far. Do we believe that Saudi Arabia is able to achieve it by 2040? Yes, at the pace of action that we're already seeing developing concretely on the ground, but I don't see that being too difficult. And the most important component into all of this is the power of our youth. You have people that are born into a generation that are not taught that anything is impossible. It's all pathways of possibilities of doing things in a wide variety of disciplines and topics that, Saudis from my generation could not even dream of, right? There's this whole aspect as well of leveraging the other 50% of your ecosystem are women. And we're seeing that being translated into the increasing number of women showing up in the workforce. I mean, the last census gave us a number of 37%. That still has a lot of room for improvement in certain sectors. I mean, that's one example. Is not being fully translated within the energy ecosystem. We're still at 4% of women representation. So you can see already that there's massive room for growth. And there are already systems that are in place to help enable that room for growth. So I don't know. I mean, to put it really bluntly, I think it's this message of hope and can-do mentality coupled with this Bedouin ethos that I think Saudis almost naturally geared to play a massive role within that space, and its ability to really leverage its know-how, for that quiet diplomacy, that rebuilding of trust, these massive chasms that are appearing left, right, and center. And I think we're lucky enough as well that we've gained confidence over the last few years. The more that we're doing, and we're demonstrating by doing, we're gaining confidence in our own abilities to push those boundaries further. So to me, there's only one way, and it's up. And honestly, if we're responsible actors, then I believe that we are, that would definitely be leveraged in pushing forth the climate agenda in a way that goes beyond these empty, void promises and more focused on what could we deliver concretely here on the ground to everyone without leaving anyone behind in this process. One thing that I always connect to, Richard and Lucian, is this notion of energy poverty. The IEA and the number that they usually allocate to that question of what mandates energy poverty in specific locations compared to others. Well, if we're telling certain countries that all you're able to do is plug in one AC for a few hours, nothing that goes beyond the 100 kilowatt hour in cities and in rural areas going down to 50 kilowatt hours, nowhere near the electricity that's needed to cool them off. And these are some of the most hard-hit places around the world. I think that there's definite lack of justice in how that topic is being approached. But that does not mean that we will continue to do things the way things were and continuing the pathway to pollution. There's always a better, more just, more even-keeled way and pathway forward. So yes, maybe because I'm Saudi, I'm proud of where we stand today. But I think even if I weren't, I would definitely see the early semblances of what Saudi Arabia can do. If Saudi does it in simple terms, then no one else has, any excuse not to do things in the appropriate manner.
Yeah, because it's getting warmer and warmer in Saudi faster. So as a leader there, that makes sense. What are you expecting coming out of COP28 coming up? I mean, what should the world expect? And then what are you expecting?
Honestly, if we're being really blunt here, the proof will be upon COP28. And I'm not one to project things before things happen. Maybe I'll go with what I hope will come out of COP. What I was hoping, and maybe might not be able to see, is a bit more rigor on how would a pathway for the oil and gas sector look like in terms of decarbonization. And I say decarbonization in terms of emissions, not by stopping those industries altogether. I believe in specific countries, under specific circumstances, for specific needs, there will still be a need for these additional barrels of oil, these additional shipments of gas. If we don't really tackle the very difficult task at hand, my fear is that it will just be some really good talk. And the atmosphere won't really care of these beautiful promises that we're making or the documentations that we're putting, right? As long as it's continuing to be on the receiving end of those emissions. So I was hoping for something that's a bit more progressive on that front, that includes the companies on the table, that ensures that this is something that is done with utmost transparency, but that engages them as opposed to vilifying them and saying you have no place at the table. And that's a big banner that was expected out of COP28, is that everyone has a role to play, and everyone has to play that role to their utmost ability. I'm expecting a lot of announcements on renewables. I think it's quite natural because IRENA is based out of the UAE, and everyone loves renewables, so I don't think that there would be too much controversy in that sense. I'm hoping, and we've already been playing that role as Arab countries in the past, for bigger representation and real representation of youth within the climate debate arena, not tokenization, not taking, young people from different countries and just parading them down the halls, but actually having them participate and having their voice heard and integrated into the process. I say that we've done it in the past because if you saw the Saudi negotiation team or the UAE negotiation team at the last few COPs, they tended to skew quite youthful. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that it was skewing very feminine, especially in the Saudi negotiation team. So, our youth in Saudi and the UAE are not tangential to the decision making. They're negotiating on behalf of the country at the most important for us. So I'm hoping for this to translate for bigger representation of the youth. The more important COP, in my opinion, to be focusing on post COP28 is COP30 in Brazil. That will be when countries are meant to increase their ambitions, when NDCs are meant to reflect a certain level of evolution. It's also coming to a country that has just regained its footing on the climate arena, that's aiming to tackle massive pressures on the Amazon and on the Blue Amazon, which is, if you extend the same Amazon back into the ocean, so be it the mangroves or the corals along that reef. I think that'll be the COP to keep in sight over the next few years. But let's say at COPs, we remain hopeful. We do what we can. We try to bridge gaps between different positions, and we see how could we increasingly be pushing the boundaries of what could be done on the climate agenda.
Your mention of youth and young people, you probably saw that recent ruling in Montana, where a group of young people won a major climate case, by arguing that state failed to protect their right to a clean environment. I mean, it's a compelling argument. I also think it's fascinating your discussion. I love your reference to the Bedouin approach. Issue of trust, though, and the role Saudi could play, because coming out of the Paris Agreement, I think something we're not experts, we're just observers, but it's clear there was really no grasp on the energy transition, how fast it was going to come, what was needed. And specifically, you referenced it, the consequences of energy deficit. If you can't make the switch, you still have significant swaths of the global population who, are energy deprived. So how do we bridge all this? And then, of course, there's issues of a transfer of support from more developed countries to emerging economies. It's all like, who goes first? It's all a matter of trust. And with each one of these COPs, it's been interesting to see, trying to get a little more rigorous in your goals, trying to be a little more specific, and then holding you to that. With each step, it's sort of trying to build trust. And that is interesting how you say Saudi Arabia can play a role with that.
Honestly, I would most definitely think so, but not necessarily maybe within the COP process. And I'm glad that you brought the issue of litigation into the mix. What people need to understand is that Saudi is extremely risk averse when it comes to its global positioning and what it's mandated to do or not do. And this is why I say the Bedouin approach. If you saw our NDC, anyone upon first glance would know that our current plans take us well beyond those ambitions. Let's say if we have a consistent improving curve on that let's say buildup of confidence as we achieve some of our goals and targets within that space. But what you put into your NDC sort of opens you up to this gray area of what can or cannot be brought into the litigation space, right? So I understand maybe the risk averseness of the country wanting to commit on things that are more stringent on the NDC itself. Where I think it matters is action. So not what I'm saying I will do, it's what I'm actually doing. So to me, I look at the Saudi situation in two different prongs. Maybe within the COP process itself, because of what we have to do in a lot of cases as well. A lot of countries that want to push certain agendas do not want to be at the forefront of doing it. I think Saudi has been scapegoated in a lot of situations for things that other countries would love to do or know that Saudi Arabia would not be allowing as red lines, so they can, posture and look like they're doing,
right,
what needs to be done, but because they know that Saudi will have to position itself in a way to block certain advancements within that sense. I've made my peace of thinking, and because I see this happening and translating on the ground, what we're committing to on the COP space is not what we're doing on the SGI space. And I'm more interested on what's happening on concrete action on the ground. So what are the projects that are being developed? I mean, I don't want to list a long list of numbers, but if we're looking at the renewable energy projects that have already been signed, and I think to date we've already exceeded 100.4 gigawatts and are already surely on our pathway to achieving the rest of our 50% goals or targets by the intended timeline. Although some might argue that that has progressed slowly, but to us who understand the complexities of the legislative side of what policies needed to be in place, of the infrastructure that would enable the uptake of these renewables, know that it will just be a question of going slow, but then going really fast. The other thing that really caught our attention was the commitment that His Royal Highness made last year around the natural gas power plants. So the decision was made that no new natural gas power plants were to be commissioned without carbon capture. I mean, to my knowledge, no country of the scale of Saudi Arabia has made such a commitment. So you're essentially saying that for the bulk of your additional 50% that was meant to be reliant on natural gas, a good chunk of it will be decarbonized. And over time, the rest of the system will take hold as an opportunity to decarbonize. The establishment of the carbon capture and sequestration hub out of Jubail, we know that to date, there was a national commitment of CCS target by 2035 of 44 million tons per annum. And we've already heard that even before launching that project that aims to achieve 9 million tons annual by 2027, companies around that hub were already oversubscribed. So the ask is already exceeding what the plans were. So, and that's even before beginning that initial operation. A lot of the commitments that we're hearing out of NEOM, for example, on hydrogen, primarily green hydrogen, some of the conversations that we're hearing around green maritime fuels, the list goes on and on. I'm not going to list everything in one go. That's also being paralleled with the PIF's commitment in collaboration with the Tadawul for the voluntary carbon market. We've seen two sides of the equation. We've seen our friends, for example, in SABIC, priding themselves of having bid for the least amount possible because of how stringent their own policies for buying carbon offsets were. So we're seeing really sophisticated conversations emerge within the system that gives us confidence on what that trajectory will look like. Now, it's within that space of this parallel effort to the COP that I think confidence building will come into play. To the point that you were sort of alluding to, there are a lot of countries that are being asked to forego development goals and aspirations because of this pathway to decarbonize. I say this because if there was truth to giving an alternative pathways, we'd see this being translated in the amount of funding and financing that's going to that sphere. I mean, again, it's a question of pace. The money that's coming out of the World Bank or any of these multilateral banks is not enough to bridge the gap of what's needed to be developed within those countries. So the whole continent of Africa, some of the countries in South America, in addition to Southeast Asia. So there's a lot that needs to be done within that space. And again, that's another space on the finance piece where I see Saudi starting to play a more sophisticated role. So I don't know if you've caught the conversations of His Excellency Al-Jad'an last year at WEF around commitments for foreign aid and that concept and tying of sustainability into financial sustainability and how that money is being spent. So it's not the same mode that we're taking, let's say, to support some of those kinds of efforts. More recently, multiple signings that the Saudi Fund for Development are spearheading all around the world for certain energy projects, primarily anchored around renewable and hydros. So it's starting to emerge. I think, again, to me, and understanding that Bedouin approach of we need to gain confidence within a space, the more that we do, the more that we feel that, yeah, that's actually working, the more that we gain confidence and the more that this will prove to be of value. Because at the end of the day, the crux of the matter is, again, on action. If we can walk the talk better than anyone, then yeah, maybe we can start playing more of a role in bridging that gap of trust.
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's fascinating your distinction between the COP process and Saudi Green Initiative. And how, I think that's one of the things that Saudi Arabia has done well over the last, since 2016, but even over the last 5 years specifically, is they've done the work. In other words, you have a proposition, you have goals, this sort of thing, but in order to get there, you have to do the work. But the thing I love most is, and I think it's a mantra we should all endorse and adopt, is under promise and over perform, and the world would be a better place.
I could not agree more. I think, yeah, let's talk more action. We say in Saudi, shammer, so it's quite literally just removing the cloth off of your hand and getting your hands dirty and doing the work. That's what needs to be done in all seriousness. Less talk and more action.
Princess Mashael bin Saud Al Shalan, founding partner at Aeon Strategy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which played a leading role in support of the kingdom's net zero targets under the Saudi Green Initiative and the Circular Carbon Economy Framework. Mashael, it was a delight to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both, Richard and Lucian. I hope I haven't overwhelmed everyone with all of this information, but it's just to say that we're just at the very beginning of a long journey, and it requires all of us to have a deeper understanding of sometimes, spaces that we did not subscribe to, just as I did at the very beginning. I thought I was going to, but maybe it would have been better off if I went to security studies. I would not be